Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman, see I can say that right. I'm Lara Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, here today with my colleague Khaled Elgindy of the Middle East Institute. Today is September 22nd, 2021, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation with Tariq Kenney-Shawa. Over to you, Khaled.
Tariq is a graduate research fellow with me at the Program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute, where he'll be doing a fellowship for the coming academic year, thanks to a grant from the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He's also a master's in international affairs candidate at Columbia University, where he's studying conflict resolution, international security, and journalism. During his time as a graduate student, Tariq has consulted for the New York Times, where he researched far-right extremism and threats posed to journalists, so quite timely. Before that, Tariq worked as a security consulting firm based in New York City, where he covered conflict developments across the Middle East and North Africa. You can and should follow Tariq on Twitter at TKSSHAWA, that's TKS-Shawa on Twitter.
Terrific. So welcome, Todd. We're so happy to have you. Can you, just as a starting point, can you introduce yourself briefly to the audience with a little more personal data than what was in that bio paragraph? Where are you from? Where's your family from? What are you most interested and passionate about when it comes to research and policy fields?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Lara and Khaled. Hello, everybody. I'm Tariq Kenney-Shawa. As Khaled mentioned, I'm currently a second-year Master's in International Affairs candidate at Columbia, CIBA. And I'm studying, as Khaled said, the intersection of security, conflict resolution, and then my specific interest is journalism. I was born in New York. My father's Palestinian, my mom's American. Kind of starting from that, very different kind of backgrounds. And then I spent most of my life growing up in the Middle East, but there was a lot of back and forth between the Middle East and New York. So at the end of the day, New York has kind of felt like home to me. But I think that childhood kind of informed my interest in my overarching interest in international relations, politics, and then over time, I became more and more interested in storytelling and how the way we tell stories, kind of molds our political perspectives and, in a larger extent, molds foreign policy itself. So I think that's kind of what pushed me down this path, so to say. And I'm still excited to see where it ends up. I've got one more year of graduate school left, and then it's kind of a return to the real world.
Great. So Tariq, recently you wrote an article that was published in 972 magazine entitled "Palestinian Americans Are Turning the Tide of U.S. Policy." So for folks who haven't seen that, we'll include a link here in the text that accompanies this podcast. So, I mean, this piece is interesting because it's also the subject of your research at MEI for this coming, for your graduate fellowship. So there's lots of reasons to sort of probe at it, and it's especially timely, I think, just given recent events. So we have a lot to ask you about, but let me start with this. So you write specifically that Palestinian Americans are, quote, indelibly shifting the narrative around Palestinian liberation, and that this was clear during what you describe as the widespread mobilization of Palestinians and their supporters. So can you talk a little bit about this mobilization, what it looked like and what impacts it had? And also, how has this recent mobilization sort of played out recently in the context of the Gaza and Jerusalem crisis that we saw this past May?
Sure.
Especially especially in comparison to previous conflicts that we saw, for example, the 2014 Gaza war? What was different this time around versus last time?
Yeah, so to give some background on kind of my current research focus, I'm really looking at the shifting narrative around Palestine and the Palestinian struggle in the context of public opinion in general, but mainly in the US because of my Palestinian American background and focus. And then going further, how it may or may not translate into actual changes in US foreign policy. So kind of along that vein, part of what I want to determine is whether there's a general threshold that these types of issues must actually cross in order to actually impact US foreign policy decisions. So this summer, while I've yet to do actual survey analysis, and while I hope to do more actual in-depth analysis of this, I think there's definitely a noticeable shift in the narrative around Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And I think pretty much it can be kind of boiled down to several factors. One of them being the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, which really, I think, galvanized the social justice movement in the US and kind of opened up the conversation for some of these issues around systemic racism, police brutality, and white supremacy, these issues. And I think a lot of them intersect and can be applied to the conversation on Palestine. So I think that was, a fundamental part of making the conversation that we had this summer about what happened in May and June in Sheikh Jarrah and Gaza. That's really some of the main factors that made it possible. But as you mentioned, I think a more long-term contributing factor to this shift has been emerging young Palestinian American activists who have grown up with their parents' stories, grown up with a very deep connection to Palestine and a strong desire to get involved and a strong desire to place themselves in positions of influence and actually influence US policy. So while it's difficult to actually record kind of this metric change between this summer and 2014 and, for example, 2008, just because it's a long process of analyzing data on Twitter, hashtags, quotes, etc. I think there's been a noticeable shift in the online discourse in the progressive community, and not just the progressive community, as well as moderates and people across the spectrum, in which not only are people actually talking about Palestine, Israel, and what's happening, for example, in Gaza, people are actually sympathizing more with Palestinians and tying their struggle to what's going on in many cases in the US. And I think that's the main thing that I noticed has shifted, is just the public discourse, is the number of people speaking out for Palestine, and not only on social media in the halls of Congress, when we have representatives like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and the growing list of progressive representatives who are actually championing the Palestinian cause in Congress. And I think that's another example of just the tangibility of this shift.
Thanks, Todd. And I know that we want to get back to you a little bit more on what's behind this shift in the narrative or in the grassroots. I'd like to go back to your piece again. I'm going to read you part of the piece. You said that the events of the past summer, quote, reminded the diaspora of our integral function in the increasingly diverse global movement for Palestinian liberation. More importantly, Palestinians have proven not only that we are less fragmented than we had feared, but we're indelibly shifting in that language, the narrative around our struggle for liberation. So I want you to talk a little bit more about this impact. So how has the narrative changed from what you've seen? Or again, I know you want to do broader research, but just impressionistically, how has that narrative changed? What is shifting specifically about it, and with whom? Who's being impacted by this engagement? And how, if you can talk a little more, how you see this playing out in progressive politics itself.
So I think the main shift is formalizing in people's approach to viewing Israel as a stable ally of the United States that shares values and political ideologies with the United States. And I think what has changed is that more people are drawing attention to the realities of occupation, the realities of the war crimes that Israel commits in Gaza, the realities of the ethnic cleansing that are ongoing in across the Palestinian territories, but especially in May and Sheikh Jarrah, and that are still ongoing. And I think this is obviously more effective when it comes to people on the left, the Democratic Party, because I don't want to jump the gun here, because in the US, the US is still a very pro-Israel oriented voting base and a very pro-Israel oriented leadership. But in recent polls, there's been a shift on the left, and in general, I think it was 48% of Democrats sympathize more with Palestinians compared to 33% with Israel. And one of the biggest shifts in years. And then further data points point to growing generational divides with younger Americans substantially more sympathetic to Palestinians. And then this is kind of expected, I guess, with the Democratic Party, which has started incorporating more and more progressive issues into its general platform. But I think a more surprising shift is actually the changes in public opinion among evangelicals, which have been described as Israel's most reliable support base in the U.S. And Shibli Telhami actually recently conducted a study. He's, I believe, at the University of Maryland, where I think 40% of younger evangelicals and this was from 2015, I believe, wanted the U.S. to lean more towards Israel over the Palestinians, while only 21% shared that same sentiment in 2018. So that's a notable shift in evangelicals who have served as a very staunch supporter of Israel. So I think not only with regards to the U.S. left and the Democrats, I think that this shift is kind of happening across the board as people are able to more clearly see the Palestinian narrative and understand the Palestinian perspective, and then in turn empathize with Palestinians themselves.
So really what we're talking about is a broader, what it sounds like is we're talking about a broader shift in public opinion in general, or is it sort of concentrated in specific, with specific constituencies, the young, women, people of color, people who self-identify as liberal, or is there a broader shift? Because the example you gave of public opinion among evangelicals, that's, I think, pretty surprising. I think a lot of people would find that kind of unexpected. So is there a broader shift? And I want to get at, like, what is your take on what is fueling this shift? Is it is the narrative shifting because the message and the messenger is changing, or is it because of the receptivity of those receiving the message has changed, or some combination? Is this just the function of people learning more about Palestine, or is there something deeper, maybe more ideological going on in sort of American culture?
I just add, also learning more about what's happening with Israel. Is it the people now, it's the de-exceptionalization of Israel as there's freer flow of information. Is that a complementary factor, maybe?
Yeah. So,
and if I could just tack on to that too, sorry to bombard you.
It could be a very big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, because I think this is really what ultimately people want to know is, where is this coming from? Because that helps us understand where this might be headed. Are there particular groups, in terms of the audience and the message and the messenger, are there particular groups or movements that you see as spearheading this effort or this shift?
Yeah, so it's I definitely believe it's kind of like a huge mix of kind of like all these different factors coming together to kind of like push this change. But to address the first question, I definitely believe that this shifting perspective on Israel is definitely very much concentrated. It's definitely more concentrated among progressives, Democrats. But as the data says, it is also shifting the national conversation as well. So while it is making more headway amongst Democrats and progressives, the rest of the U.S. population is kind of following suit. And I guess some people could tie this to general political trends and how politics slowly ebbs and flows over time between shifting left. And as for example, Bernie Sanders' presidential election campaign kind of like showed, it's these opinions are getting more and more popular amongst the general voting population. So yes, while it is definitely concentrated within the Democratic and Progressive Party, it is also showing signs of shifting the general population. And then to address the next question, sorry, you're gonna have to remind me which was next in this order.
Well, my piece of it was, are there particular groups or movements that you see as kind of spearheading this shift? And just to sort of give you a little bit more context, what I find really remarkable about this moment is, if one were to do a cost analysis of dollar for dollar spent on pro-Israel advocacy versus pro-Palestine advocacy, I mean, the gap is enormous, right? I mean, there are institutions, we all know them by name, that are dedicated, to preserving and expanding the U.S.-Israel relationship and deepening that exceptionalism that Lara talked about. If you look at the infrastructure of Palestine advocacy, it's far, far smaller. And I can't help but wonder if they're sort of punching way above their weight, right? I mean, we still have a long way to go in terms of changing the politics and the policy, but there is that noticeable shift. So I'm just curious, are there particular groups that you think are more responsible for driving that change?
Absolutely. So I think, yeah, as you said, I do agree that pro-Palestine groups in the U.S. especially have been punching above their weight, especially in regards to just looking at funding levels. Pro-Israel lobbying groups like for example AIPAC spend at a much higher level than any similar comparison in regards to pro-Palestine groups. Not that there is really a similar comparison, because there isn't,
or any combination of groups, even
combination of groups. Yeah, because there isn't that same centralized lobbying, very well funded and government funded lobbying source. So the source of support from Palestinians has been, by and large, grassroots efforts led by protest groups, led by Palestinian American activists, led by individuals, and led by emerging groups like the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, for example, or even organizations like, for example, Let's Talk Palestine has been very active on social media and has been very active in kind of developing this discourse and guiding it in the right direction. And then I also want to kind of draw attention to the work of organizations like Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, which kind of more recently have drawn more attention to the apartheid nature of Israel. And I think it's important because, of course, Palestinians have been making that argument for years, but I think it really ties into our argument, and it really kind of gives the Palestinian movement fuel to and kind of like a legal basis to work off of. And I think that's been extremely important in contributing to this shift in narrative, because it's given people a legal framework through which to actually view Israel's occupation and actually view Israel's treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel, etc.
Thanks. I want to shift a little bit to the question of policy. So we're talking about public opinion and narrative, and we've talked a little bit, you mentioned Bernie Sanders' campaign politics. We've seen, the emergence of a more vocal contingent in Congress that expresses concern for Palestinian rights. Where do you see the likelihood of this shifting, this delivering a change in policy? Because we haven't really seen that yet, right? And to the extent that the Biden administration has differed from the Trump administration in many areas, or claimed it's going to roll back things that Trump did on Israel-Palestine, I mean, the policies are pretty status quo. The discourse, for folks who listen to confirmation hearing today for the new ambassador, or last week for the assistant secretary. But at the same time, we have yesterday's drama over Iron Dome. So what are your thoughts on translating the prospects of seeing this translate to a shift in policy?
So that's the question that I think my longer term research hopes to answer. And but right off the bat, I think the question of when it's going to actually impact U.S. policy is going to be a matter of years or decades. I think that the changes we've been seeing in public discourse, this narrative, this cultural hegemony that has kind of been present for so long, these are very, very gradual changes that require decades and decades of in a sense seeping into the public's understanding of Palestine, of Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle, and the experiences that Palestinians go through. I think that in order for it to translate to policy, actually U.S. policy, is going to take decades. And I think, something that's I've been thinking about recently to kind of, compare it to is the, the popularity of Medicare for all in the US. I mean, poll after poll has surveyed general, population opinion on Medicare for all, and has found that it is widely popular, even a majority in many cases, and has increased over time. Yet the Democratic Party, despite the fact that is even more pronounced within the Democratic Party and within the emerging progressive component of the Democratic Party, they have yet to kind of like incorporate that, or even like a serious debate about that, into their platform. So to be honest, and perhaps this is a pessimistic approach to it, but I worry that there could be an even more substantial shift in public opinion around Palestine, to which a growing number of Americans, call for, conditioning U.S. aid to Israel, call for, eventually, supporting, movements like BDS, but that reluctance to actually incorporate it into mainstream platforms slows that process down. But I mean, the other argument is that, as we saw yesterday, with the progressive component of Congress, kind of, or of the Democrats pressuring them to remove that the $1 billion additional funding for the Iron Dome system. That's, while it is problematic for Democrats in the long run, strategically, I think that does show that, okay, things on the ground are, shifting when it comes to actual policy change. But as I said before, I think it's going to be decades before we see substantial changes that will actually have an impact on the occupation itself.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the most striking things about the whole Iron Dome drama over the past day or so is that there is a group in Congress that is actually willing to take political risks and hits, because they're being criticized across the board, from the right and from the left and from the center. Was this really a strategic move? Aren't they shooting themselves in the foot? this is going to pass anyway in a different form. Why are they falling on their sword? But what it really shows is that there is a group that is prepared to pay a political price. And I don't recall a time when that was the case. But sort of shifting gears a little bit to look at the Palestinian side of this equation. I want to ask you, so in your 972 piece, the same piece that we've been talking about, you also write that the May crisis in Jerusalem and Gaza demonstrated that Palestinians are not as fragmented as many of them and many others thought they were. So what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, is this a new era of Palestinian unity, or what does it mean in practical terms?
So I think that in May and June, we saw kind of an unprecedented level of Palestinian unity within the West Bank, Gaza, even surrounding countries like Jordan. For example, when thousands of people marched towards the border with the West Bank in Jordan, I think that is something we haven't seen in years. And then the repeated and connected uprisings in towns and cities within Israel, I think that kind of showed in a way that hasn't been evident over the past several years that Israel's policy and Israel's ongoing policy, though very effective of divide and conquer, has not totally silenced a collective Palestinian struggle. But to say that it's a turning point would be, I think, jumping the gun a little bit, just because of the amount of obstacles Palestinians face in Palestine and Israel to collective action. And I think what the aftermath of May and June kind of showed in regards to the Palestinian Authority's crackdown on public dissent, on peaceful protests, I think that goes to show just how many obstacles the Palestinians within places like the West Bank and Gaza still have still face, because they're up against not only Israel, but they're up against their own leadership. So there's definitely this dissonance between what I see as the Palestinian streets, the grassroots efforts, and the Palestinian leadership. So I think the bigger fragmentation now isn't necessarily between territory. It isn't necessarily between the West Bank and Gaza. It isn't necessarily between Palestine and the diaspora. I think the big gap in understanding is between the general grassroots Palestinian activists and their leadership. And I think that's going to be the biggest hindrance for collective action in regards to kind of like formulating a new political approach and a new collective strategy.
So you have perfectly anticipated the direction I wanted to go with this, which is, so you've got this growing distrust of leadership, frustration with authoritarianism, corruption, incompetence, confidence is at an all-time low. We saw polling, I think, today on this. And of course, the protests, which were sort of brutally repressed, and the whole discourse around the murder of Nizar Banat. So assuming that you could actually see the shift in narrative that you're talking about relate to a shift in politics and maybe even in policy, how does this affect the actual interests of Palestinians absent a credible Palestinian leadership that can capitalize on it?
I think that's the question to ask next. And it's something else I'm also hoping to kind of delve into a little bit further with my research is that, of course, narrative can be a tool for liberation, but how can we advance it further than just, debating, okay, is narrative shifting or isn't? And I think the first issue is to address is that fragmentation that I just discussed. Both the fragmentation within, between Palestinians that has shown to be less of a serious issue, after May, since we've had such, just in light of the territorial solidarity, but more in regards to, our leadership. So I think it's pretty widely known now that the Palestinian struggle is at a crossroads. It's becoming increasingly recognized that the two-state solution has failed and has, been defunct for a long time now. And the one-state reality has become increasingly entrenched. And I think this, and this is what many people are saying, this is not something new at all. I mean, a lot of Palestinian activists, both in the US, in Palestine, are saying that this necessitates a paradigmatic shift in political strategy. But the fragmentation and this disconnect between grassroots activists and the leadership has postponed this debate and has forced us into this kind of dead end of pushing our diplomatic avenues towards this failed push for two states and ignoring the more important debate now that I feel is to explore alternatives. And I want to be clear that I'm not arguing specifically for one or the other political endpoints. I think there is a lot of disagreement still amongst Palestinians about, what level of or what specific political, organization they would support. But I think this debate needs to be held at a higher level, not just within, the grassroots activist circles. And I think this debate needs to be held at a higher diplomatic level in order for it to gain legitimacy.
Picking up on that very thought. So, you write in this piece about this new collective voice that is speaking out for Palestinian rights, that is, coalescing among Palestinians, both inside and outside of Palestine. And that's very important. Mobilization and new platforms are critical. But I sort of keep coming back to this question of wither politics. How can you really bring about any real change without politics, and specifically institutional politics? And so, as this past, earlier this year, there were elections scheduled for Palestinians. They were supposed to be across the board for Palestinian Legislative Council, for the presidency, and even for the PLO's parliament, the PNC. Those were summarily canceled at the last minute by President Abbas. One of the many reasons for his very sharp decline in popularity. One thing that we've seen, though, is that young people, I think there was a lot of excitement around the idea of elections because Palestinians are starved for change and starved for participatory politics. But I noticed among younger people, there was a kind of, by which I mean like in their 20s and 30s, who were skeptical or at least ambivalent about the prospect of elections, that maybe their elections, might end up doing more harm than good, or at least consolidating some of these negative trends. And there's a whole movement, actually, I think it's called Al-Jil Al-Jadid, right? That is sort of pushing against elections and in a different direction. So I'm just curious where you fall on the institutional politics or lack thereof question for Palestinians. Should they have elections? What should those elections be for? If not, what's the alternative to bringing about political change or reform?
I think that's a great question, and it's a question that I'm not sure I have a full confident answer to, because it's something that I'm still mulling over and that I want to be mulling over in the long term. I think before, first, a big thing that I want to work on and that I think, we should work on is trying to establish better bridges between the Palestinian diaspora and Palestinians in Palestine, so that we can, kind of merge these conversations so that it's not like, we're having one conversation in the US about Palestinian politics and Palestinians in Palestine are having an entirely different conversation. And that often is the case. And And while we do, see eye to eye on many things strategically, I worry sometimes that there's a dissonance between diaspora political discourse and political discourse in Palestine. So that would be, in order to answer that question, I think better bridges need to be built between these two segments of the Palestinian population so that we can have this, political conversation together. And then to address your question about, to address your question about, the elections themselves is, what I worry is that, I personally I would have welcomed elections. I would celebrate any opportunity to not have Abbas continue as the Palestinian representative. But at the same time, I wonder if elections would just be kind of allowing the entrenchment of this inherently. Oh,
keep going. Anyways, I'll come back.
I worry that it would kind of cause the entrenchment of this post-Oslo inherently flawed political order that just allows for the creation of a Palestinian Authority that is solely oriented towards making occupation easier for Israel. So the conversation I think we need to be having isn't necessarily just about are we going to have elections or not? And I think that's kind of tripped us up a lot because we've gotten into kind of like circular conversations about are we going to have elections or is Abbas going to cancel them, which eventually is inevitable. I think the conversation should be is what do we want our leadership to look like? What do we want our long-term political objectives to be? And what kind of framework do we want to fit them into? Because at the end of the day, if elections were held, we would have a new president, right? But we would be in the same political situation. The occupation would be the same. Everything down to the areas that the PA has sovereignty, quote unquote, over would remain the same. So I think the framework itself of a Palestinian Authority needs to be debated. And I think the issue with this election discourse is that question is being relegated to, the ivory tower discussions. And I think that needs to be the conversation we're having, on the ground rather than just amongst us.
So I think as the last question, I want to circle back to something you talked about earlier, which was the sort of political moment we're in and how it interacts with the Palestinian cause. The global movement for rights, those of us, the movement for decolonization, for equity, not just equality, but equity. Can you talk a little bit about that and about how this generation, in that sense at least, differs? And maybe not just on Israel-Palestine, the sort of activism of this generation differs. And specifically when it comes to the Palestinians younger Palestinians in the diaspora, how this relates to how one thinks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or whatever you want to call it, and the Nakba itself, and what resolution means.
So I think to frame my answer, I want to quickly just explain the importance of the international community in the Palestinian struggle. I think, unfortunately, Palestinians themselves do not hold significant hard leverage over their occupier. And in order to end the occupation and in order to exert pressure on an occupying force, you're going to need international support. And this was what was seen in apartheid South Africa, so that while grassroots efforts led by Palestinians in Palestine will always be the spearhead, will always be the most important factor and must be focused on and sustained, I think that cultivating international support in a very similar way that was done in South Africa is going to be crucial to pressuring and pressuring Israel to loosen its grip. But I think that, as you mentioned, I think the changing conversation today, what that does is that enables this. And I think that what the issue is that, 10 years ago, while Palestinians were more or less saying the same thing, more or less making the same arguments about apartheid, about war crimes, for example, in 2008 or 2014, I think today's political environment where people are more receptive and open to having this discourse around human rights, around equity, around, applying these conditions not only in the US, but to a general approach to humanity, I think that has been critical in allowing this conversation to continue. And then what that means for the Palestinian struggle itself, and what that means for a solution to this, for lack of better words, conflict, or for a solution to an end to this occupation, is that I think solutions are going to take a very different form than just the simple kind of straightforward, you get this, I get that, independence. I think a solution is going to have to be a lot more collective, and is going to really involve a lot more creativity than has been put into it as of late. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a good answer. Khaled.
Yeah,
actually,
thanks.
I'm sorry, before you do the outro, because we're gonna do a little outro here, but Tariq, I want to give you a chance to just explain or give the background of the painting behind you, because I suspect people who are watching this on video are going to be thinking, that's gorgeous, what are we looking at?
So this painting is by my aunt, Kenney-Shawa. She's London-based, and she does amazing paintings, not just paintings, sculptures, everything under the sun. And she's, as you can see, beautiful. She has very diverse style. A lot of her work kind of verges into kind of political, and really tries to argue a political point. But I would definitely direct anyone who is interested to check out her work. Kenney-Shawa, London. If you're in London, I think her work is at the British Museum, and
very cool.
Several other galleries.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So as Lara indicated, we are out of time. And so thank you so much, Tariq, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I, for one, am very much looking forward to your research, and I'm sure many others will be looking out for your work in the coming weeks and months. And thank you, Lara, for having me join this terrific conversation.
Thanks, Khaled, for joining me in this terrific conversation, and thanks, Todd, for joining us. I hope we can have you back as your research proceeds with MEI and beyond. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in, and I want to remind everyone to go to the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, where you can subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast so you don't miss any of the great content that we are getting out pretty much every week. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify, and then the video of this is also being produced as a podcast for YouTube. So with that, we'll end it here. I'm Lara Friedman.
And I'm Khaled Elgindy.
Signing off for now. Take care, and thanks for listening.